Welcome to Love Factually, the podcast that analyzes rom-coms and romantic films using the science of close relationships. We're your hosts, Paul Eastwick and Eli Finkel, and we'll be welcoming a very special guest in just a few minutes. But first, Eli, what are we talking about today?
Today, we're talking about 1999's Eyes Wide Shut, Stanley Kubrick's haunting and surreal masterpiece on marriage, sex, and power. Some of the themes we'll explore are the experience of romantic jealousy, the fragile nature of identity, and the many ways of depicting sex on screen.
And fair warning, we'll be spoiling this movie today. So if you don't know how important it is to get the receipts out of your coat pockets before going to the coat check at the masked orgy, then go ahead and watch this movie and come back. So Eli, tell us, who are the key characters and couples in this movie?
The central relationship is the marriage of Bill and Alice Harford, who are played by Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. The two actors were married at the time, and their involvement with this film may have contributed to their ensuing divorce. Bill is a successful New York doctor who is supremely confident that his marriage is invincible. When his sense of certainty gets shattered early in the film, he falls through the looking glass, embarking on a sordid nocturnal tour through New York's sexual recesses. Alice is between jobs as an art gallerist and is the primary parent to their daughter. Her marriage to Bill is strong, but she is tempted by other men and is repelled by Bill's unwillingness to acknowledge the possibility that either of them could ever be unfaithful. A major supporting character is Victor Ziegler, a billionaire patient of Bill's who hosts the plot-animating holiday party and who is involved in a terrifying elite society that hosts ritualistic orgies. Both Alice and Bill have sexualized links to other characters. Alice is linked to two other men, a suave Hungarian man she meets at Victor's party, and an unnamed naval officer for whom she would have abandoned her family in exchange for a single night. Bill is linked to many women other than Alice, including two models who appear to be seducing him into an epic threesome. He also interacts with multiple sex workers and with a grieving woman who confesses her undying love for him. So, Paul, those are the chess pieces. Are you ready to give us 1 minute on how the film moves them across the board?
No problem. Count me down.
All right. On your mark, get set, go.
Dr. Bill Harford and his wife Alice attend a fancy holiday party hosted by the wealthy investment banker Victor Ziegler. Alice flirts with a Hungarian businessman, Bill flirts with two young socialites, and then helps revive a prostitute named Mandy who had OD'd. The next evening, Alice confesses to Bill a sexual fantasy about a random naval officer, which shatters Bill's sense of security in their relationship. Bill embarks on a night-long journey which includes a seduction attempt by a grieving patient and an unconsummated rendezvous with a prostitute. He learns from an old friend Nick about a party he can only attend with the password Fidelio, a mask, a tux, and a cloak. After a most unusual rental process, he arrives at the party, which is an occult-like orgy clearly hosted by powerful people. When Bill's identity is discovered, a mysterious woman offers to redeem him, and he's warned to leave and not ask questions as his life could be at risk. Bill retraces his steps and the next day repeatedly encounters ominous signs. It discovers Mandy is dead, and Victor himself admonishes Bill to stop poking around. After finding a mask on his pillow, a terrified Bill confesses everything to Alice. They go Christmas shopping, and Alice declares that they need to fuck as soon as possible.
Perfect. About 59 seconds and you got everything in.
I feel like that was a lot. You know, the plot is not as essential in this movie as other components of it. Right now, though, I want to welcome in our guest today. Now, our guest is the host of the Peabody Award-winning NPR show Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, and the screenwriter of the manuscript that would eventually become Dirty Dancing 2 Havana Nights, Peter Sagal.
Peter Sagal.
It's a pleasure to meet you guys, and I think it's particularly exciting we're all wearing capes and masks.
You gave it away.
How better to discuss this particular film?
Only on top, Peter.
Yes, I know. We'll see what's underneath later.
Shame. So tell us. So Peter, what is your relationship to this movie?
I, like all well-adjusted, normal, right-thinking people, am a big fan of Stanley Kubrick. I think I've seen all of his major films except for Barry Lyndon. Mm-hmm. And I went out dutifully to see the film. When it came out, knowing, like everybody did by the time it was finally released, that it was his last movie. By the way, which means, as many people who I've been reading in the last couple of days pointed out, the very last word ever said in a Stanley Kubrick movie.
Yeah.
Fuck.
Yes. Fuck. Anyway, And I saw it at the time. I remembered certain things about it. I was not thrilled by it. I did not think it was as good, at least from my particular perspective, as, well, I will go so far as to say, all of his other films that I've seen. But I certainly thought it was an interesting Kubrickian kind of movie with that coolness that he's famous for, that reserve, that strange formal kind of compositions that we constantly think of when we think of Kubrick, etc. Coming to it now, many years later, almost 30, 25, say, I find my perspective on it very, very different. I'm obviously older. I've been married twice. I was just a very young married man at the time. And I've learned a lot more, I think, about sexuality, human sexuality, male, female, about sort of the weird engines that drive our minds in a way that I would have, put it this way, if you had said some of the things that I now believe to me when I first saw the movie, I would have been shocked. And like I said, one of the things that I hadn't thought about when I saw this movie the first time was something that I knew of, which is that in the 1960s, Stanley Kubrick, then pretty much at the height of his fame and influence, discussed with his good friend Terry Southern, the guy who worked on the screenplay for Dr. Strangelove. I find out that there's some dispute about how much he actually contributed. They talked about how amazingly cool it would be to make a dirty movie, a pornographic film, with Hollywood standards, with really great equipment and actual beautiful actors. Because this was the 60s and porn movies were horrible little, 8mm things that got shown at what were called stag parties. And so the idea of like doing one on like 35mm film in Technicolor with real actors and with somebody of Kubrick's ability was very exciting. Obviously that didn't happen then. I know about this because once I found a book called Blue Movie that Terry Southern wrote in the 60s, in which that happens, in which a director, a big successful Hollywood director, goes out and makes a dirty movie with all the accoutrement of Hollywood. The book is dedicated to Stanley the K. Stanley Kubrick, and there's a director character, and there's a director character, obviously, in the book, who I don't know enough about Kubrick's life at the time to know if it was like even credibly a depiction of what Kubrick did and thought. That director, for example, has a pretty healthy, healthy kind of debauched sex life you might anticipate in Hollywood, and Kubrick obviously never did this in real life, but he apparently maintained his interest in the idea. I also found out just recently, as I sat down to watch the film again, I knew this, that Kubrick had optioned the rights to the underlying material, the novella, usually translated as dream novel or rhapsody novel, by Arthur Schnitzler, 30 years before we made the movie. So around that time. So in the mid-60s,
no kidding,
Kubrick has optioned this novel, this very frank sexual novel. He's talking with his friends about, like, could you make a pornographic movie that was actually artistic? And he finally, as we know, makes this movie. And so I can't help but see it as the culmination, successful or not, of this interest he had in making a sexually explicit artistic film. Even though, to put it mildly, that had been done in various ways many times in the 30 years since he first thought of it, Last Tango in Paris and many, many others. And that gets to all kinds of thinking about like what Kubrick himself thought about sex and what he was trying to express and why he felt, obviously he didn't know it would be his last project, but he spent years on his projects and why he decided like this was going to be the one. It's very interesting. And perhaps we will figure it out now.
Yeah. Eli, tell us about your relationship to this movie.
It's similar, I think, to yours, Peter. I'm also something of a Kubrick completionist, and this is the movie that stuck with me. It's the only Kubrick that I couldn't get out of my head, and I think I've now seen it 8 times, and increasingly with every viewing, I like it more. I find it more interesting, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation today.
For me, this is just a holiday classic. I think every year, this is the one that I would love to put on around December 21st. Feels like about the right time. And, my partner is sometimes game, and sometimes she's like, not this year.
I have to say, like I said, been marinating in this movie for 48 hours. And it just occurred to me, it's a Christmas movie. There's Christmas all over it. Yeah. It's like there's like people even talk about how the Christmas scheme allows Kubrick to light in greens and reds. It's a Christmas movie. I mean, we argue about Die Hard. There's no argument here. This is a Christmas movie.
I'll take them both. So I want to talk about what this movie gets right about the nature of close relationships, but I feel like I should also note with this movie in particular, because this movie is depicting things it isn't endorsing in a way that a lot of movies aren't quite as nimble. And so that makes this movie a little challenging to fit in our typical framework, but nevertheless, we will press on. So tell us, what do you all think this movie gets right about the nature of close relationships?
I should say, by the way, before I talk about the film, I went and for the first time ever read the original novel in translation, obviously.
Same. It was the first time I did it. And it was really satisfying. It
was very satisfying, which is a strange, I felt a sense of completion when I finished it. And it's fascinating to read that novel, which was written in the 1920s by this writer who was part of the interwar period, the Vienna demi-monde, which takes place around 1900 and is as sexually frank as anything you could read, with the exception of its language, which is very polite. It's about sex. There is, to quote the movie we're discussing, there is fucking in this novel, and it's really intense. And not only that, but there's a lot of, I think, amazingly precise and accurate insight into sexual psychology. Apparently, again, I learned this just this week, Schnitzler was friends with Freud. And so he obviously was very open to the idea, which I think is absolutely central to both the book and the movie made from it, that you do things without actually knowing why you're doing them. The whole idea of a subconscious, right? And so that all leads me to say that the most accurate thing about the movie, whether or not it is depicted as well as it is in the novella, is the idea that a wife's sexuality, her libido, her discussing her sexual ideas, her sexual conquests, although I think in both the book and the film they're all theoretical, could both be very angering to her male partner, her husband, and very hot and very sort of erotic and inspiring, And that the man in question, the doctor in both novel and film, doesn't really know which one it is. He thinks a lot of times in the novel, and we assume in the movie, that he's angry. He's angry at his wife, when what he really is kind of turned on. And he doesn't know it, and he doesn't understand it, and he doesn't want to admit it. And that, to me, out of all the things, and I think there's levels of bullshit in the movie, but I think of all the things in the movie, that strikes me, certainly at my age and maturity, as the most accurate.
So I love that you brought that up, because that indeed jibes pretty well with what the close relationships literature generally shows about jealousy, right? So the idea that jealousy is toxic for relationships, it's a pretty decent size effect that the more I experience jealousy, the less happy I'm going to be in my relationship. And there are better or worse ways of communicating about jealousy to try to get through it, but generally speaking, it's not a good sign, and it's certainly not a good sign for people to be vigilant all the time about their partner's exploits in that way. But it's also really interesting that you brought up the idea that it could be a turn on at the same time, because this is kind of a recent strain of research in this space, at least showing that when you force people to confront appealing possible alternative partners, at least they themselves maybe get a little turned on for their partners in particular. So I'll describe this study really briefly, and then I'll toss it to Eli here. But in brief, the way this study works is that they get people to have a fantasy about somebody who is not their current romantic partner, but somebody else that they actually know. Okay. And after you go through that fantasy process and you think about what it would be like to hook up with this person, and they have you report how much you're sexually attracted to this other person, well, indeed, it has gone up above baseline. But what's also gone up in the meantime is your sexual desire for your current romantic partner. And in fact, if anything, it's boosting your desire for your romantic partner more than it's boosting your desire for this other person. So it's this great example of sort of rechanneling sexual desire in this way, from being about an appealing alternative and sort of rebounding it onto your partner. And so I think we kind of see that in this film. I think that's kind of what's happening, like as they go home from the party the first night and have hot sex, and she's looking at herself in the mirror and kind of remembering how sexy she had been earlier that evening, that's a little bit of what's going on there.
Okay, I am loving all of this. I do want to comment on the jealousy thing, but first, I'm intrigued by your observation, Peter, that Dr. Bill is turned on by the idea of Alice having sex with these other men. There is some cool research by Justin Lehmiller showing that about 50% of straight men have fantasized at least once about the idea of watching their wife or girlfriend have sex with another man. I remember being kind of shocked when I learned that.
Yeah.
Okay, so on to the jealousy thing. There's clearly jealousy in this movie, and in fact, the movie's often talked about as like a study in sexual and marital jealousy. And I think the sexiest scenes that you see are in his head, right? That is, Bill, Tom Cruise's character, is having thoughts about what sort of sex his wife might have been having or wanted to have with that naval officer. Of course, that's also sex that never really happened. It's one of the few scenes, probably the only sexual scene in the movie, that is actually kind of pornographic and hot, as opposed to Kubrick's standard chilly remove. And one thing that I've actually found interesting as I've spent the last 48 hours in this, and my eyes are bloodshot because I haven't slept as I've been studying this movie and trying to make sense of it, is I'm not sure that this is first and foremost a movie that's about jealousy. I think it's more a movie about identity and like epistemic certainty about the world. And so what happens to Tom Cruise's character? What happens to Bill Harford when his wife says, I could have had this affair. I wanted to have this affair and I would have left you. If that guy had basically snapped his fingers at me for one night, I would have left you. And then what happens isn't primarily a jealousy story. It's an identity-shattering story. He has a story that he's telling himself about what his relationship is and how there's no way that it could ever be anything other than indestructible. And when she keeps talking, a cornerstone of his identity disintegrates. He falls into this sort of confusion. And this is also a theme in the relationship space. Researchers like Sandra Murray and John Holmes spend a huge amount of time trying to understand how all of us, with of course full knowledge that our partners aren't perfect, that they have flaws, nonetheless dispel doubts about their choice to spend their life together with this person, and somehow manage to view their partner as just about perfect, even despite the evidence in the contrary. And I think that's what this is. I mean, she says to Bill, Alice says to Bill, you sound very sure of yourself. And he says, no, I'm sure of you. And she just cracks up in his face. And at Ziegler's party, Sándor, the fancy Hungarian guy, says, don't you think one of the charms of marriage is that it makes deception a necessity for both parties? Now, I think at least the basic interpretation of that is that each of us lies to our spouse. But I don't actually think that's what this movie's about. I think it's the lies we tell to ourselves. And so when he says marriage makes deception a necessity, I think what Kubrick may mean, at least this is my interpretation of the film, is that in order to have a successful and effective marriage, we have to be willing to blind ourselves to certain sorts of unpleasantnesses. And that's the way that we're able to have happiness and fulfillment in the marriage.
One of the things that I would need to be convinced here is that this is a movie about marriage at all. When I think what it is a movie about sex. And to the extent that marriage is a container for sex, that marriage is something that we as a society have constructed in order to sort of, put sex into so it can be controlled and limited, and thus how we have thus changed our ideas about sex to fit into the model of marriage, that I'd buy. But I don't know if this is a movie that you'd go to see to get an insight about how a marriage could or should work, with one exception, which is that at the very end, and this pretty much comes, I think, from the original source material, when Nicole Kidman says, after he has confessed everything, and by the way, when you think about it, he has nothing really to confess. He never actually touched any other human being. I can imagine, I was trying all night, honey, but...
Yeah, right.
And she says,
Only as sure as I am that the reality of one night, let alone that of a whole lifetime, can ever be the whole truth.
And no dream is ever just a dream.
The important thing is we're awake now. And hopefully for a long time to come.
Basically what she is saying, and I honestly think this was, if anything, the message, quote unquote, of the original novel, which is that a marriage, which is this box for certain things, and we all know what is inside that box according to standard tradition, which has been, of course, changing a lot in, among other things, the decades since the movie came out, that you need to have the ability to have erotic imagination and for your own sexuality to escape that box or to understand that it will, And then now I'm sort of imposing things on the movie that weren't actually said, that one of the keys to a successful marriage is that you and your partner agree as to where the real boundaries of the box are, right?
So what if, let me offer an interpretation of the movie, that's, I think, related to this question of, is this a marriage movie? And I want to run this by you, Peter, to see what you think. So one thing that was striking to me about the movie, we've alluded to it a little bit, is that the sex isn't hot. Even like the massive orgy with the most gorgeous women who have ever existed somehow is like completely devoid of eroticism. And sex seems to be tied up in all sorts of awful stuff.
Yes.
Right? So
it's very dangerous.
It's very, very dangerous, right? That is like 2 or 3 different times. It's literally tied up in death. It's tied up in relationship dissolution. It's certainly tied up on failing to rise to the occasion on the part of Bill, but also Alice. And so there's a reading, I think, of this movie that is shockingly conservative, at least in contrast to the general view that the movie is an orgy-suffused free-for-all.
Right.
And this reading is that sex is something that should stay within marriage. And maybe that's what we're seeing at the end, is maybe Kubrick is offering, again, a shockingly conservative message here, which is desire is perilous. It's basically adjacent to death and carnage unless it's within the bonds of matrimony, which, if that's true, that does seem like a marriage story.
Yeah, I mean, I remember somebody once said about Fatal Attraction, it could be like a movie you show for like sexual hygiene to Marines. Like, don't screw around, guys, because look what happens.
Right. Yeah.
If I could offer an observation that maybe brings your two ideas here into harmony about, is this movie about sex or is it about marriage or is it about relationships, and exactly how do we make all of that fit together? I guess one way of thinking about what happens in the majority of this movie is that it is showing sex and relationships in tension in some way. So he is as Bill goes throughout his odyssey, he is seeing all of these different manifestations of sex and the way people pay for sex and all of these rituals surrounding sex. But it's certainly not the kind of sex that brings any kind of intimacy. It's not the sex that in any way like builds up a relationship or is even reflective of any kind of passion, really. It's just not in there at all. And I guess to get to the conservative idea, although honestly, I think it fits the science pretty well, when we get to the end, it is a reminder that even though this marriage has kind of been destroyed, that they are interested in rekindling it. I end up having a very positive interpretation of the ending, and that they want to rekindle it. And what is the way you do that? Sex. Sex is how you build something like that back up from the ashes, and that is literally what she suggests there.
Yeah, I think we can all agree on that, fellow heterosexual men. Yes, that sex is the best way to improve things in your relationship.
I've heard good things.
That's the number one. Other things about what this movie gets right.
To me, and this I think is central. It's I think Nicole Kidman's best scene in the movie, where they're discussing the difference between male and female sexuality, right?
Women don't. They basically just don't think like that.
Millions of years of evolution. Right? Right? Men have to stick it in every place they can, but for women it is just about security and commitment and whatever the fuck else.
A little oversimplified, Alice, but yes, something like that.
If you men only knew.
Mm-hmm. We have been holding this back because you want us in this role. You want us to, the classic and false Darwin idea of men spreading their seed wherever, women looking for nurturing and stable relationships. Bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. And in a weird way, you could describe this movie by saying this is a movie about a guy who finds out that fact and can't deal with it. That turns out that women, his wife, have the same kind of, shall we say, far-ranging sexual imagination and libido that men do, which is very, very threatening to men. And as I think I've already established, and Schnitzler established in 1926, very, very arousing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, there are indeed all sorts of nasty and pernicious relationship beliefs that people sometimes hold that tend to be associated with things like relationship conflict, like being less satisfied in relationships, and those things include having essentialized beliefs about gender. So strong beliefs that men and women are fundamentally different in various ways. Those things tend to bode very poorly for relationships. And so, yeah, on that point, the movie pretty much nails it because it is indeed his holding of that belief that is responsible for part of the escalation of the argument and for his breakdown afterwards.
Right. One of the differences, I think, between me seeing the movie when it came out in 1999 and me re-seeing the movie only for the second time now in 2024 is, as I said, it's been a long few decades. And in those decades, it seems as if our culture has proceeded leaps and bounds to accept what I just said, that female sexuality is as, shall we say, emotional and as wide-ranging as men. In fact, and here you guys will correct me, I believe there was a famous study that found that female sexuality is even more fluid than male. Women can get excited by all kinds of things, but we men tend to be run on narrow tracks. So we live in a world in which, for example, very nice professional New York wives can write memoirs about their deciding to be polygamous and how, right? And how that is exciting and that she can bring that excitement home and it helps their marriage. We live in a world in which there is a whole genre of pornography called cuckold porn that a lot of men apparently find really exciting, that whole notion. And so looking back on this movie, when she says that to him, when Nicole Kidman's character says it to Tom Cruise, maybe, Tom Cruise's reaction in 1999 is, that's ridiculous. That's impossible. What are you talking about? What do you mean? You saw a guy you just wanted to fuck so bad that you would have done it just like I would if I saw a woman that attractive. Now I'm like, well, yeah. I mean, doesn't everybody know that now?
Yeah.
Shouldn't they know that about women? And don't the people who refuse to admit that to be true are not good people, or at least they need to sort of work on their, their consciousness, I guess I should say.
So it's really interesting because there is this recent review of the literature on gender differences in the sex drive and trying to establish like how big those gender differences are and where they emerge. And I think, Dr. Bill is guilty of having some pretty essentialized beliefs about just how big those differences are. But what I find fascinating about this recent work is that it tends to find that the differences are the biggest with the very observable behaviors that you can really see, right? Or maybe the way men and women talk about their sexual desire. It's kind of moderate for things like fantasy, but it's pretty small for the arousal that people experience, right? That sort of gut level desire that people have. And the smallest component you see in established ongoing relationships. It's in those cases where the difference in sexual desire is very, very tiny. So I think that also helps to explain why, unless you're really going to have like a frank discussion with somebody, unless men are going to have frank discussions with women about how much sexual desire they really experience, they're going to have the wrong idea, and I think that's what we see with Bill here.
Yeah.
And actually, Paul, there's that work by Amy Muse and her colleagues suggesting that in the context of ongoing relationships, men underperceive how much desire their partner has for them, right? For strangers, that effect always goes the other way. Like, if it's like, oh yeah, how much did she want me or how much did he want me? Men are over-perceiving women's desire. But within the context of established relationships, I think people are misapplying some of their stereotypes, and they basically are under-perceiving how much their partner is into them, desires them today, and consequently are like probably initiating less than ideal.
If I were to put my finger on one thing that I think that the movie could be accused of misunderstanding, but again, it requires a certain reading of the movie, and it is never quite clear to me exactly what the intention is. But one could say that what the whole sex cabal is trying to show us is that, well, when you get people who are rich and uninhibited enough to escape from modern norms, they're going to live out our true primal destiny, which is to have like group ritualistic sex, and this is like close to the dawn of the human condition. And this is an idea that is out there, like in the science and in pop culture too, is that like sex used to be very free and very uninhibited, and it used to be very common for people to engage in sexual sharing, and that just wasn't a big deal. And
well, when you say used to be, how far back are we looking?
Yeah, right. So like pre-agriculture.
Right.
These are some of the arguments in the book Sex at Dawn.
I know Chris Ryan. I read the book.
Yeah, there you go.
So and I also know that some people think that's all nonsense, but and Chris Ryan just wanted to justify his own lifestyle. So I'm aware of both the argument and the debate about the argument.
Yeah, so there you go. So again, not knowing anything about Chris Ryan personally, I think the way that I would frame this is that there is great variability in the way that cultures can adapt to sexuality. There are going to be cultures where it is more free than others, but I think what is orthogonal to all of that is that sex plays a key role in close relationships, and human romantic partners frequently bond to each other, and they bond to each other through sex. So that's not to say that like ritualistic sex, occult sex orgies can't be a thing. But trying to understand, trying to fully pull out sex from the nature of bonding, passion, and a close relationship between two people that feel special, that I think is the part that maybe like the Sex at Dawn ideas kind of miss.
Yeah, I think so. There's another idea which I thought you were about to reference, which is this notion that one of the things that you get when you become extremely wealthy, one of the things that is a motive to become extremely wealthy is sexual access to sexual fantasy, actual access to the kind of event. And this, this orgy scene, this sex party is like the weirdest and, in a weird way, the most adolescent kind of version of that idea. That, you know what I bet rich people do? I bet rich people join up in this mansion and they put on masks, right? and there's a famous...
I like that.
There's a famous debate about this movie, about the censorship of that 65-second walk through the orgy, right? You guys are aware of this? That in order to get an R rating, they had to digitally impose some figures, so that you couldn't see how graphic the sex was.
Yeah, some of the cloaked figures just seem like they're in the way.
Right, and I gotta get out of the way. And there's a huge debate about that and whether Kubrick really would have approved of it or not, and how prurient and how puritanical the movie studio was. Doesn't matter. If they didn't have those guys standing there, so you couldn't actually see what those naked figures were doing exactly, I think it would have been funny. Because they have all this insane ritual and the incense and the music, which is apparently like backwards playing chants or something, and they're just copulating. They're just, I mean, what's the famous quote? The expense is extreme and the position ridiculous. And in a weird way, that lies behind a lot of these aspirations that, if I'm a billionaire, I can throw amazing sex parties. And we know that they actually do, right? Some of them to extraordinary and sometimes criminal excess. This is a thing that rich people have, let me put it this way. To whatever extent rich people actually do this, I don't know. I'm not that wealthy. I don't get invited to those parties. Yeah. But I do know that it has been a fantasy, right? That if you do get that level of power and wealth, you get access to the sexual wonderland. And this is a version of that, which is both, I think, accurate as an imagination of what it must be like, but ludicrous as a depiction of what they're actually like. I don't think the parties at Jerry Bruckheimer's house in Hollywood look like that, right?
Right.
They have music with a beat, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, are we okay with this movie? I mean, are there things in here that present moral quandaries when viewed 25 years later?
I think the one thing which is obvious, which is this is entirely from the perspective of upper class heterosexual men, right? How many, what percentage of the women in the film, we don't even get to see their faces. They're literally just faceless bodies. And that the women who, with the significant exception of Nicole Kidman, who also appears naked a lot in the movie, at least we get to see her face, every other woman is just an object of desire or a sexual possibility.
Marion, the daughter of the man who died, she has a proper scene.
Yeah, she has a good scene, but again, her entire role in the story is to be a possible sexual contact with the hero. The women in this movie only exist as sexual objects, objects of fascination, objects of action, objects of guilt, whatever, for the men. And that's fine, I guess. But if we're going to say it's a movie about sex, it's really a movie about heterosexual male sex or heterosexual male sexual desires, thoughts, obsessions, dreams, whatever. And you need to clarify it that way before you start saying it's general rules about human sexuality.
And heterosexual men discovering that women also like sex, but with this kind of remove, that it's like a fact he has learned, and makes him very upset and confused.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird in that it's a movie whose central, as we discussed, whose central plot pivot is a wife confessing that she has the same kind of erotic imagination and sexual desires as her husband, and then we leave her entirely. literally back home with the kid. And he goes out and he acts on his sexual obsessions and interests and whatever. And she doesn't get to. Right? So we're like, oh, yeah, this is a woman who's got like a full sexual imagination and erotic whatever. And now we're not going to see her again, except in his fantasies, which again is...
In fairness to Kubrick, I think he's critiquing a lot of this.
Okay.
So I think he sees what you see. I mean, again, I don't think he has a 2024 lens on these issues. You know, he grew up in New York in the 50s. But I think he's kind of devastating some of what he's showing in the film. And in particular, the thing you were talking about, how like rich guys, you know, have these basically subservient, every woman has the exact same body shape, what is, you know, the conventionally perfect body shape. They're all 6 feet tall. They all wear stilettos, naked other than stilettos, basically. And I think he also is not just presenting that, but critiquing it.
Huh. I'm not quite sure. By the way, one of the things I wanted to point out is that in this is a callback in Clockwork Orange, right? Toward the end of the movie, where Alex has been conditioned, the Ludovico technique. Yeah. So he now has been conditioned to have an extremely negative physical reaction to sex and violence. The way they test that is they put him on a stage in front of observers, and they bring out, I can't remember if it's 1 or 2 naked women. And he reacts as he starts to feel desire for them with nausea and terror and pain, as he's been conditioned to do so. Those women look exactly like the women at the party scene. They're tall, skinny women, perfect breasts, wearing thong underwear and stilettos. It's like that is a particular kind of erotic image of women that Kubrick apparently has had for a while.
Oh, he has that image. I just think he's also critiquing the men who are obsessed with that image. There's nothing fun about these men. And Bill, he feels, I think, complexly about Bill, but all those men at that orgy party and Ziegler, I think he feels like these men are pathetic, and that ultimately you get to live this fantasy and it's no fun.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I see that. I'm not sure I see. I mean, for example, let's take that. When I say added, I mean added to the original novel scene where Bill goes up to the fantastic palatial bathroom and revives Mandy, is the character's name. And is that scene, in addition to the role in the plot it plays later, because there's an implication that somehow Mandy, in her mask at the party, recognizes him in his mask and out of gratitude rescues him. That's the implication. By the way, I also found out 2 different actresses played Mandy, and also Cate Blanchett did the voice of Mandy.
I know. 3 different people.
I know, played that one, which is interesting in and of itself. So that scene, the scene in the bathroom, that could play a bunch of different ways. I think, in addition to the plot function, it also plays, Bill gets a glimpse of this sexual heaven, the sexual nirvana that's
and she's almost dead.
She's almost dead, but what happened? Ziegler says, oh, Bill, could you come up here for a minute? Yeah, I was fucking this gorgeous woman in the bathroom in the middle of my Christmas party. You've met my wife. She's here. And she passed out. And Bill never says to him, Ziegler, what are you doing? Your wife is downstairs. Your friends are all downstairs. You decided to go in here and have a fuck just in the middle of this party? He never says anything. I mean, obviously, he's not going to. That's not his role. But does that glimpse of that sort of, again, sexual nirvana, that kind of life where you can just do that, does that help set him off on his journey? Does that make his interest in what Nick Nightingale has to tell him? Does that, just like fuel it? Because, oh man, you mean I can get into one? I can be one of those people? I can get into that world too? I don't know. But,
I can almost be a necrophiliac?
Yeah, exactly. But what I don't get in the scene is any condemnation, right?
No, it's, just not that fun.
Yeah.
I also had just little stuff with, am I okay with it? I mentioned some stuff earlier about like the amount of pessimism about casual sex, I think is misplaced and kind of a bummer. I think the movie appears to be saying that if your partner is attracted to another person, that kind of counts as infidelity or something. Like it's something in that space. And the line that's really relevant here is when Alice is very angry. This is the sort of the pot-soaked fight they have at the beginning that sort of sets off the whole thing. And Alice says, "You're saying that the only reason you didn't sleep with those women is out of consideration for me?" And she's really angry about that. And I can't figure out why that would be a problem.
Yeah.
And I guess her logic must be, you shouldn't have desired them in the first place. That the desire itself was the infidelity, and the fact that you might have resisted the desire because you love me or you're considerate for me, like, that's not something to be admired. And, Paul, you've heard me quote Hélène de Botton, like the contemporary philosopher, and he basically throws the conventional moralization about infidelity on its head. And he says, spouses who remain faithful to each other should recognize the scale of the sacrifice that they are making for their love and for their children, and should feel proud of their valor. And I think that's where I am.
Yeah.
I think it's not atypical. I think it is normal to experience romantic and sexual interest in people beyond the partner. I'm not saying every single person does, but I don't believe it to be a deviant experience. And I think what's heroic and beautiful is people saying, no way would I want to do that because it would hurt my partner and harm my marriage and my family. And so that is a noble thing in my view.
Right.
So, what questions does this movie raise about the nature of close relationships that we wish we knew that we don't have good answers to? We've talked about some of these things already, but anything else to add here?
I'll take this one first. I'm interested in what happens when partners disagree about what the rules should be in their relationship. And I think that there are different levels of preference between Alice and Bill about how much they should be disclosing, right? So I think she thinks that to live an honest and true relationship together, when these naughty thoughts occur to us, we should share them. And I honestly find her aggressive in how she shares them. She literally laughs at him. She mocks him. She talks about how in her fantasy she was mocking him. I think it's kind of a lot. I think somebody like Alice and other people who are reasonable could say, no, that's what honesty is, and you're supposed to disclose this stuff. And I'm reminded here of Leslie Baxter has this this relationship dialectics theory, and she argues here that all of us in relationships confront these sorts of tensions. And the one that's most relevant here is openness versus closedness. And this is the desire to share everything versus the need for privacy and boundaries. And I think this couple's in trouble because I don't think that Tom Cruise's character can really get too comfortable with the level of openness that feels minimally acceptable to her. And what really worries me about the end is that now that they've come back together and there's been this full circle, I worry that they're about to restart the whole movie a second time. Remember, this is the part where she says, we're now awake. And he says something like, yes, forever. And she says, well, I don't know that I'm comfortable with forever. But for now, we're awake and now we need to go fuck. And I think they're now heading down a road again where she's going to be too disclosing that's going to be comfortable for him. He's going to be shaken by it because it's not what he's going to want. And we're going to basically witness Eyes Wide Shut 2.
I'm trying to imagine what that would be like.
Havana
Nights, exactly. I'll do the original story, and then it'll get ruined.
Well, on this podcast, we rate movies from 1 to 5 stars, just what we think of the film. And now this is a polarizing movie among critics, among Kubrick enthusiasts, and I have a feeling we're no exception. So, Peter, why don't you take it first? How do you rate this movie?
I'm gonna again. I'm afraid, the International Kubrick Society will come and have me kill me. I'm gonna give it 2 stars because again, I think that if it wasn't directed by Stanley Kubrick and it didn't star those 2 people, and it wasn't, among many other things to make it interesting, this incredibly expensive movie that shot for a year and a half that was in the press. I think everybody would be looking at this movie and going, what? What the hell? And people would be talking about these obvious, things that, again, from my perspective today as a much older and wiser, usually learning things the hard way, but still wiser person, looking at them and just seeing that they're idiots, that come on, Bill, your wife being sexual is hot. That your anger is tied. Of course women want to fuck just as much as men do. Don't you know that? And also, it's not that hard to get into a sex party.
Peter, you have a lot of knowledge about this.
In my case, it is almost entirely, and I'll let the almost hang out there. Secondhand. For example, the New York Times. Not only have they been covering polyamory in Brooklyn, they just did a piece about tourists who are going to sex parties in Paris on vacation. Couples going to sex parties together. They're arranging it like you do in the Airbnb. And I don't believe you have to bring masks, and there's no passwords. Yeah. If this is something you want to do, you can go do it. It's not, let me put it this way, that this idea of that kind of complete libertine sexuality, of giving over entirely to this like depersonalized sex, which can be very erotic, I guess, for a lot of people, is not that exotic, and it's not that, remote from people. If that's something you want to do, you can do it. This idea that like only the very richest, most powerful people get to have sex like that. No, a lot of people get to have sex like that. They just want to do it, and they put in the effort to arrange it.
Yeah, but it is like the adolescent fantastical version of the thing.
Yeah, which is weird and strange for a man who, was in his late 60s when he made the film.
Right. Eli, what about you?
Well, I am much less wise and far younger than Peter, and I have to tell you, this movie is a 5-star masterpiece. I completely love the ideas it has about relationships, some of them right, some of them wrong, but all of them thought-provoking. And this through the looking glass aspect of what happens when the foundation, the scaffolding, the cognitive work you've done to build up a story about who and your partner are together, when that shakes, when that shatters, what comes on the other side, I found this to be a scintillating portrayal of what that experience would feel like psychologically.
I, too, for me, this is also a 5-star film just because of how much it makes me think every time I watch it, right? It's so thought-provoking in the way that it interweaves sex and relationships. But on this podcast, we also rate these movies on Rust Bolts. Now, the Rust Bolt is named after Eli's advisor, the late, great Carol Rust Bolt, pioneer of close relationships research, with 5 stars indicating a near-perfect depiction of the nature of close relationships. I think I land on 4 Rust Bolts with this movie, although honestly I've bounced back and forth between 1 and 5 at various points when you try to figure out exactly what is the movie saying and what is the movie endorsing, or what is it just showing you is an argument that some people think, but I land at 4, and for me it's really tied together by the idea at the end that sex and relationships often, but not always, go together. So Eli, what about you?
Yeah, I also came down at 4. I think it's really thought-provoking, interesting. A lot of the ideas seem on target, or at least the way I'm interpreting them. Occasional misses, but mostly hits. 4 Rust Bolts from me. And Peter, throwing it over to you, we don't assume that you know the entire relationship science literature, but in your view, how accurately did this capture what you think is wise about how relationships work?
I think that it, and as I think I've been saying, it did capture some things that are true. To me, those ideas are, I think, more familiar than they certainly were to me when I first saw it. Let me put it that way.
Interesting.
And so putting myself in the mind of who I was in 1999 and watching the movie, and everything that I have sort of discovered and learned subsequently, I'll give it at least a 4, I'll say. Because, like I said, there are certain things about it that are crazy. But the thing that is most important, that I'll say was stronger in the source material than I think ended up in the movie, is that this notion that underlies all of this, and the essential truth, which is that we are driven by erotic impulses, romantic impulses, all kinds of impulses that we ourselves don't understand, even as we act on them. Yes. I think there's something about the way that Bill seeks out this, and goes to an extraordinary length, obviously, to get to this party. And if you were to ask him in the middle of it, if like you could like knock on the screen and say, "Excuse me, Mr. Cruz, Bill, whatever, just checking with you, why are you doing this?"
Yeah, he doesn't know.
He doesn't know, or he wouldn't be able to admit it to himself or to you. He'd say, well, I'm just so curious, just to see, sort of his life experience. And then, no, he's got this insane combination of anger and lust and regret and a feeling like a sexual FOMO, I guess. I don't know, that's driving him. That to me is far more useful when thinking about like actual relationships and sexuality than most movies that make the usual mistake of conflating lust with love and assuming that people are able to understand and articulate their own feelings, which in most cases they are not. In my case, I am not. So that's why I give it more points for accuracy than quality of the film.
Well, that is all the time we have for today, so we very much would like to thank Peter Sagal for joining us today. This
is really fun. I never get to talk about this stuff on NPR. This is great.
Yeah, right. They never let you do this.
No.
And Eli, I will enjoy doing this with you next time.
I am looking forward to it. The Love Factually podcast is produced and edited by Paul Eastwick and Eli Finkel, featuring music from Andrew Fraker & Sons.